Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar. I will share a few housekeeping notes. Everyone has been muted on entry. If everyone could please use the Q&A pod to enter your questions. While we will review the chat, we will be using the Q&A as our main source for responding to questions in today's webinar. Today's webinar is being recorded. The webinar, along with a copy of the slides, will be posted to the CSBG webinars page. I'll now turn it to Minette. Thank you.
Thank you, Nikki. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the fiscal year 2023 CSBG Annual Report webinar series. We're continuing our targeted training and technical assistance, and today we're going to go over the SmartForms as a brief refresher. Next slide, please. If you haven't already heard my voice or seen my face, please allow me to reintroduce myself. My name is Minette Galindo, and I have the honor and privilege of serving as the Policy, Data, and Evaluation Branch Chief here in the Division of Community Assistance within the Office of Community Services, where we administer the Community Services Block Grant. Today, joining me to provide the SmartForm refreshers is Kayla Lennon, our Community Services Program Specialist, and Melissa Cameron, Director of Research, with our colleagues and partners over at NASCAS under our Performance Management Alignment for Training and Technical Assistance Cooperative Agreement. I'm going to turn it over to Kayla to provide an overview of today's refresher so we can get started. Kayla?
Thank you, Minette, and good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. For our overview today, Minette just finished the welcome. Thank you so much. I'm going to cover the reporting requirements review, and then I will pass it back to Minette for an overview of the SmartForms, and then our colleague at NASCAS, Muska, will cover completing the SmartForms before myself and Minette finish up with tools and resources before ending with some final reminders. We can go ahead to the next slide. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started with reporting requirements and why we report. We can move to the next slide. Great. Some of this should serve as a refresher if you were able to attend some of our earlier webinars this cycle, but of course we want to make sure that we review them again. So here it is. The CSBG Act, Section 678E outlines the requirements of the CSBG Act, including the requirement to submit annually and provide a measured performance of state, or Sections B, D, G, H, and I, an account of expenditures of funds, including administrative cost, or Section E, and a description of training and technical assistance offered by the state, or Section F. Next slide. This timeline may look familiar to you. As we discuss additional targeted TTA, there are dedicated webinars to unpack each of these critical steps. Today's webinar is focused on SmartForms and XML exports. SmartForms are vital records for the CSBG annual report, and CSBG eligible entities are advised to retain all the data that is entered into the SmartForms because there is a quality assurance review process and it is common that errors may need to be addressed. Retaining original data is crucial for corrections required for accurate reporting. Next slide. During this year's submission, we realized that there may be some confusion about how to complete your submission for modules 2 and 4. If we do not receive a complete submission, there will be delays in the future release of the SmartForms and the federal review. Therefore, we want to make sure that we provide some specific guidance. A complete submission of modules 2 and 4 includes uploading all XMLs for all reporting eligible entities. This means that all XMLs must be uploaded successfully and saved. And lastly, include any comments that may provide additional clarity to your data. We'll discuss this more in detail in the December 14 webinar. Next slide. And I will now turn it over to Minette for the SmartForms overview.
Thank you, Kayla. I did get a note in the chat that my volume is a little low, so if I can just get confirmation that I'm coming through clearly.
That sounds good.
Thank you, I appreciate it. So a brief overview of the SmartForms and just kind of, I guess, a SmartForm 101. SmartForms are tools used by CSBG eligible entities to submit their data for the CSBG annual report directly to their states for modules 2, 3, and 4. You'll see it on the slides abbreviated as M2, M3, and M4. As illustrated during Kayla's slides, CSBG eligible entities then submit these smart forms to their states with comments as reviewed during the previous webinars. States then export it as an XML and submit it into the online data collection system, or OLDC. A key distinction is smart forms are utilized by those states and territories that do not operate a database. And we'll talk a bit more about that in the next slide. The smart forms are pre-populated and essentially customized as an internal control with the CSBG eligible entity name, the unique entity ID or the UEI, and the previous year's data. Next slide, please. During the week of November 27, OCS began the release of SmartForms. If you did not, a state, and this is specific to our states because we send them to states for dissemination to eligible entities. If you are a state that did not receive your SmartForms, please contact your data and evaluation specialist or your program specialist. That information and the full contact list will be shared towards the end. But just as a note, there are instances where delayed data from previous years will impact the timely release of the smart forms, as Kayla indicated before. The smart forms are built based off of the previous year's information, so an on-time submission allows us to get them out to you all as soon as we can. Another note is that we do recognize that there are certain state IT systems that have firewalls that prohibit the transmission of the types of files that we send. Because smart forms are sent as zip files, oftentimes your state system might scrub that information or prohibit the email from being sent. To ensure the files have successfully been delivered to you, we'll continue to follow up until we receive a confirmation of receipt. We have identified a solution to those that have IT systems that don't allow for the delivery of zip files or attachments. But in order for us to implement that, we need to know that you've successfully been able to receive the email with the attachments, open them and access them, and that they're working properly. On November 13th, OCS, along with our partners at NASCAS, hosted a webinar specific to those states that operate a state database. You remember on the previous slide, the smart forms are targeted to those that do not have a database to collect the information within modules 2, 3, and 4. OCS hosted a webinar for those states that do operate a database. NASCAS reviewed the resources developed to support the submission for those that operate a database. Shortly, you'll see a link in the chat to the vendor portal from NASCAS. States with a database also receive their smart forms as a contingency in the event of any technical issues. We all work in the digital space and recognize that sometimes technology isn't friendly. So we did want to make sure that you had that information just in case you need it. States are strongly urged to retain copies of the smart forms for their records, at least until the successful closeout of the fiscal year 2023 submission. On that note, eligible entities are also urged to retain all data that's used to complete the smart forms, as all of the data, when it's submitted from the state to the federal office, goes through a federal quality assurance review process, and there's a likelihood that your state may come back to you and request revisions. So we do want to strongly encourage you to retain your records that you use for the module 2 and 4 submission, so that your state has access to the information for any subsequent revisions. For states with a database, please review the resources available to support your FY 2023 submissions in the vendor portal available through NASCAS. For more information on those with a database, please review the recording for the webinar that we hosted specifically for those states with a database, held on November 13th. The recording will be available on the CSBG webinars page. It is also encouraged that you update your data and evaluation specialist should your state choose to switch from database to smart forms or vice versa during the reporting period. This ensures we get you the right information and we get it to you on time. NASCAS has updated the vendor portal with the updated XSD forms for those that operate a database, and that will be available. And this is specific to those that don't require the smart form, but we want to make sure that we're speaking to both audiences, just in case there's anyone on this call who may ruminate between both options. I'll now turn it over to Muska Cameron, Research Director for NASCAS, to review how to successfully complete SmartForms. Muska?
Thank you, Minette, and good morning, everybody. Let's dive into using your SmartForm. So like Minette said, for those that do not have a state database, a SmartForm is simply an Excel workbook with built-in programming to help you enter your data. When you get your SmartForms for Module 2 and Module 4, each SmartForm will have an instructions tab. This is a pretty generic tab of information, so I would not rely on it alone to understand how to use your SmartForms. In reality, this recorded webinar is going to be your best guide and resource in understanding how to navigate your SmartForms. So do check out the recorded webinar once you get into putting data into your forms. Each form is also going to have an errors and warnings tab, and we will go into more detail on that later in this presentation. But on that errors and warnings tab, you will also see an XML export button. That button is really key. Make sure that it is actually visible and it is working on your errors and warnings tab, because that is the button that generates the XML that Minette mentioned. And for states, it is that XML that gets uploaded into OLDC, not the SmartForm itself. So you really do need to make sure that that button is there and in working order. Each SmartForm is also going to have previous year's data. And each SmartForm comes in with macros, which again speaks to that built-in programming that helps the SmartForms function. It helps them create those XMLs that are necessary for submission. It also helps with creating those errors and warnings that you will see pop up on your errors and warnings tab. So when you open your SmartForm, you will see an option to enable editing or enable content. Either way, that button is also critical in order to activate the macros. Before you start putting data into your SmartForm, and for states, before you send your SmartForms to your local agencies, I highly recommend to do a sweep of your form, whether you're a state, whether you're a local agency. It will just save you a lot of headache and trouble at the end if you do a quick sweep of your SmartForm in the beginning to make sure it is actually functioning properly. Sometimes when forms are transferred from one state to the agencies and whatnot, it might get corrupt. That is a pretty low chance, but just in case, you want to make sure you don't put all of that effort into a corrupt form and then have to redo all of it, right? So when you get your form, first do make sure that that errors and warnings tab has the XML export button and that it is working. Make sure it has the previous year's data. Make sure you are able to enable editing and enable comment. And as Minette said, the forms come preloaded with the local agency's name, state, and UEI number. So make sure all of that information is there from the very beginning. And if you don't see any of that, that suggests that you might need help with your form before you start putting in your data. If you're an eligible entity, please reach out to your state or territory lead agency. If you're a state agency, please email your data and evaluation specialist to make sure that your form is in good condition and working properly before you start putting data into it. So now moving into actually using the form. Before you begin, you will also need to unblock the macros. This was actually a new update that was pushed in Excel last year. So you already should have run across this last year if you were using your forms. That being said, everybody's Excel seems to be at different settings. Not everybody has the most updated Excel. So you might have an updated Excel this year, and this might be more relevant to you now. But if you do have an updated Excel, you will most likely have to unblock your macros. And so when you open your form and you try enabling content, what you might see is a red security risk label. And that security risk label says Microsoft has blocked macros from running because the source of the file is untrusted. That is just a standard update that Excel has pushed out in order to make sure that you are okay with the content in the forms. When you see this red security risk message, you will have to unblock the macros. And on the next slides, we will show you how to do that. So moving on to the next slide, you want to exit out of your form. So close your form and open the folder where the form is saved. Once you open that folder, you want to right click on your file, on your module 2 or module 4 form, whichever one it is. You want to right click on that and you will see a menu of options. You want to scroll down to the very bottom of that menu of options and click on Properties. And let's do a little click there. Boom. You see Properties, you want to click on it. Moving on to the next slide. Once you click on Properties, a pop-up dialog box will appear and it'll look like what you see on the screen here. In this pop-up dialog box, you should see down at the bottom where it says security, you should see a checkbox for unblock. You want to select that checkbox. Let's do a little click there. Okay, so you see where it says unblock and you want to make sure that that checkbox is checked. Once you do that, you want to click OK. Let's click. And then you are all set to go. If you don't see the checkbox to unblock, or if you don't see the red security risk label, that means that your form just doesn't need to go through these additional steps. They really only apply if your Excel is prompting you to do that. States, you cannot do this for your agency, so it is critical for local agencies to actually do this step to unblock macros on their end because it's dependent on the Excel that you have on your laptop. And this is just a note again that if you don't see the security risk or the unblock option, you may not have to worry about these additional steps. Once you do go through these steps, you should be able to enable content without any issues. And on the next slide, you will see what that looks like. So you've unblocked your macros. Now you need to enable them to be used in your SmartForms. So you might see two options. You might see either enable editing or enable content. Most of the time, you're actually going to see enable content. So you want to go ahead and click on that yellow label with the box enable content or enable editing in order to continue using your forms. Again, this activates the macros that allow the form to work properly. Okay, moving into actually entering data into your form. As you complete your form, you will notice a number of highlighting popping up. It's either going to be yellow or red highlighting. In Module 4, there's blue highlighting, which I will get to later. But for the most part, your highlighting is going to be either yellow, and yellow is if it is a warning. A lot of the times that yellow highlighting pops up when we're checking against the previous year. The reason we check against the previous year is just to make sure that the data is correct and that there isn't simple data entry errors. We've seen a number of instances where an agency might have accidentally put the data on the wrong line for this year, right? And so the flag recognizes, oh, this is a little bit different from what you did last year, and it's going to flag it yellow. It is there simply as a warning and for you to pay attention and double check that the data is correct. Anything in red is going to be an error. And that usually means that there's some logic flaw happening in the way that you have entered your data. And 99.9% of the time, your errors will absolutely need to be addressed. I've heard instances where something could be an error and the agency has a reason that explains why that error is popping up. But for the most part, unless there's a really exceptional circumstance there, all of your errors in red should actually be addressed. So you will see the yellow and red highlighting pop up as you enter data into the form. Moving on to the next slide. Just an example of proper data entry. This is a common thing that we see on our end. If you're in Module 2 and you're entering in other resources, you want to make sure that you are providing the full name, the CFDA number in the correct format, which is 2 digits, a period, and then 3 digits, and then that you are also providing the dollar amount for that other resource. If any one of these fields is not completed, the form will pop up and it will flag red, letting you know that it's not a complete data entry. So you want to be mindful of making sure that you are completing the form as correctly as possible. Now, In the Module 4 form, you are going to see a couple extra buttons, and that is because Module 4 is a much more massive form than Module 2. There are a lot of tabs to navigate through Module 4, and so we actually got feedback from the very first year that we did the SmartForms that we need to figure out how to make it a bit more user-friendly, and so that's what we added the buttons for. As you see on the top right of that screenshot there, you have 3 buttons. The first one takes you back to the instructions, but the last 2 are probably going to be the most useful for you. That table of contents button takes you to a tab that has a table of contents, and Module 4 has a tab for table of contents because it provides you links to each of the tabs in Module 4, so you can navigate much more easily rather than having to constantly scroll through the form until you get to your tab. So you can always go to the table of contents to click on a link that will take you somewhere else you want to go. It also has a button to take you easily back to the errors and warnings page, again, so that you don't have to scroll all the way to the front of the form every single time. So do familiarize yourself with those buttons, and they should help make it easier to navigate the Module 4 form. As I said earlier, Module 4 has blue highlighting, which is what you see on screen. And so blue highlighting will show up in the NPIs for that percentage achieving outcome column, as well as the performance target accuracy column. For those that have been around for a while, or seasoned folks in the network, you might recall that ages ago, we used to flag certain items in those columns. We no longer flag those in the errors and warnings tab. So if your targeting accuracy is below 80% or above 120%, it will be flagged blue instead. And it's mainly there because we really do see the forms as not just a way for you to submit the data, but also as useful information for you to manage your programs, right? So if your performance target accuracy seems to be way off, below 80% or above 120%, the form just flags that for you, just as a heads up for you. It's really important information that you can use to help inform your programs moving forward, but it will not be flagged as an error and warning. So I just wanted to point out what that blue highlighting there is for. Now, as you're completing the form, I did want to raise again attention to Module 4 items E and F in the all characteristics report. We mentioned it in the Module 2 and 4 webinar that we did a week ago, but I'm just mentioning it again here because as you complete Module 4, you will realize that there's going to be data interoperability issues, right? As you're bringing information from all of your programs at your agency, it might be hard to unduplicate all of that information, right? So just a reminder that this section does exist in Module 4 for you to write in the programs that you were unable to unduplicate information for. Moving on to the next slide. I mentioned that the forms come with year-to-year flags. In Module 2, the year-to-year flags are right there side by side against each other, and that's what I said the yellow highlighting is predominantly there for. In Module 4, because it is such a massive file and there are lots of tabs to scroll through, all of that year-to-year information is actually at the end of the form, and they're called the comparison tabs. So for your NPIs, for your services, for your demographics, you will see separate tabs that tells you what you input in for this year, and it will automatically pull the information from the tabs where you entered in that data. And then it comes preloaded with your data from the previous year. And like in Module 2, it will just highlight if there's a significant variance. Now, what does it mean for there to be a significant variance? A significant variance is when your data is more than double or less than half of what you reported last year. And again, they're simply there as an FYI, predominantly in Module 4. We actually don't even flag them on the error and warning tab. The only year-to-year comparison that we actually flag on the errors and warnings tab in Module 4 is when your total people and households served has varied significantly from the last year. In Module 2, all of your year-to-year comparisons will show up on the Errors and Warnings tab because it is talking about money oftentimes. And the reason we flag individual and household served and expenditures and resources and all of the Module 2 information is because those are some of our most requested data points, if you will. So we flag any significant variance just to absolutely make sure that the data is correct. Again, it very well could be, in which case you provide a comment, and I'll get into comments later, but we just ask that you double check the information. In Module 4, outside of the individuals and households served, your NPIs and services, they will not be flagged on the errors and warnings, which means you do not need to address them, but they are highlighted on that comparison tab just as an FYI, so you have information to help you make decisions about your programs moving forward. Okay. So moving into the errors and warnings tab, I've been talking a lot about them. Both Module 2 and Module 4 are going to have these tabs. It lists the errors and warnings that are flagging. You can double click on any one of those items and it should take you to your error and warning in the actual form so you can see the data itself. We do expect agencies to resolve errors and warnings before they submit their data to the states, and we do expect states to work with their agencies to resolve the errors and warnings before you submit the data to OCS. So when you double click on any one of these items, it should take you to the data itself on the next slide. There we go. So once you double click on an item in the errors and warnings tab, it will take you to where the warning is, and you will see a little dialog box in the form itself that also reiterates what the error and warning is. So we've tried to make it as obvious as possible so you don't have to keep scrolling back and forth. Whether you're on the errors and warnings tab or whether you're on the actual data entry tab, you should always see what that error and warning is so you can figure out what needs to be addressed there. Moving on to the next tab, you will see an example for that in Module 4. Again, notice where the arrow is pointing. You will see a little dialog comment box there that tells you what the error is. In this case, the agency did not complete column 3. Ergo, they need to complete that column. So we try to make it as straightforward as possible. That's pretty much it for navigating the forms. And I did mention that we do expect eligible entities and states to resolve their errors and warnings before they submit their form. Now, resolving it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to fix all of the data. Sometimes I said, particularly for the yellow flags, the data might be correct. The form is simply flagging it because it has standard built-in coding to flag based off of certain formulas, right? But we just ask that you double check the data. And if the data is correct and doesn't need to be corrected, then the eligible entity should provide a comment that simply confirms the data is correct. And this will greatly minimize the amount of follow-up post-submission. So Minette mentioned earlier that once you submit the data, right, states get review memos, and then those states will send those comments over to their agencies as well to fix up any errors and warnings that need to be fixed. If you take the time to address those comments from the very beginning and you provide a comment that says the data is correct, we have taken a look at it, you will not see it again on the follow-up that you get after you've submitted the data. So I highly recommend folks to build in enough time in their review process to make sure that they are addressing the errors and warnings, and they are either fixing the data as they need to, or they are submitting a comment that explains that the data is correct, and therefore we can ignore it in our review process. Just another note, again, predominantly for those old timers that have been around for a while, we are not flagging certain things that we used to flag years ago. And that includes that targeting that I mentioned outside of the 80 to 120% benchmark, the NPIs where all the targeted outcomes were obtained, and year-to-year variance for NPI services and the demographics, with the exception of individuals served and households served. So please do not submit comments on these. If you you provide comments on things that don't need to be commented on, it just clutters it and makes it harder for reviewers to focus in on the things that actually need to be commented on. Moving on to the next slide, please. So eligible entities may use the following template to submit comments to the state. This template does exist on the NASCAS website. It has stayed the same year to year, so you could, in theory, reuse your old template. Just make sure to rename it for fiscal year 23, right? But I did put a link in the chat for where you can access these templates on our website. It is a template that is available for you to use. That being said, it is not mandatory that you must use this template. I have seen states and agencies use Word documents. I've seen them use PDFs or whatever works for them, and that is fine. But this is a template that is available so that you don't have to reinvent the wheel if you don't have something currently that you are using. Now, a note for states and territories that receive comments from their eligible entities. The state should be reviewing each eligible entity's comment memo before submitting to OCS. And so we do expect states to work back and forth with their agencies to resolve those errors and warnings. That being said, once you receive the comments, just be mindful of certain things. The agency may not necessarily be addressing the error or warning in question. I've seen instances where my data is showing that there's been a significant increase in the data, but the agency is telling me there's been a decrease. And so then that raises the question, are we looking at the same thing here, right? So for states, it is critical that you are reviewing those comments yourself and making sure that they are addressing the error and warning properly. Sometimes eligible entities might be sharing preliminary information that I would say is more internal information, right, between you and between the eligible entity and the state, and wouldn't necessarily make sense to come all the way up to the federal level. So take a look at those things, and again, make sure that they're resolving the issue. And so be sure to communicate any issues with the report with the entity and offer technical assistance to help them resolve those errors and warnings, and then submit the final comments to us. And with that, I'm going to pass it on over to Kayla to walk us through the final act of using the SmartForms, which is generating the XML.
Thanks, Meska. I have a brief intermission here. So once you reviewed your errors and warnings and everything looks good, then you are ready to export to XML. The state, for the most part, will be the one exporting to XML, but you want to go to your outstanding errors and warnings tab, and you should notice an XML export button above. If you do not see that button, that means that there's something wrong in the form. So before you begin data entry, make sure that this button exists. Even if you're not the one that's going to be exporting to XML, please still make sure that this button exists and that it's working properly, because otherwise, if it's not there, or if you click on it and it's not working, then there's something wrong with the form. But if everything is working properly, then you want to click on that XML export button, and we can move to the next slide. And when you do that, a pop-up dialog box should appear, and it's going to look like this screenshot up on the screen. And so in this dialog box, you would select the folder that you want to drop in your XML file. And it works better if it's a folder that's in your My Documents or on your desktop or in your downloads, something that's actually on the PC. It may not work as well if it's on a OneDrive type of folder location, something in the cloud. But next, you're going to click on the folder that you want to drop it into and simply click OK. And that's it. You should have your XML export done. So at that point, your export is created. And then if you're a state office, you're ready to upload those into OLDC. And I'll pass it back to Meska to talk about submitting comments.
Thanks, Kayla. So as Kayla said, you're going to be uploading your XML into OLDC, but also you want to submit those comments I mentioned earlier. You want to make sure that you are attaching comments to the state level form in OLDC. And I know there's an OLDC webinar happening next week on the 14th. So you might see information about that there on how to attach a file in general. But otherwise, previous OLDC webinars, which are still posted, the recordings for those, you can just take a look at those and they should walk you through how to attach those comments. But it is very important for state offices that you are attaching the comments properly, because you've already put in all of that work with your eligible entities to address the errors and warnings. And if it's not attached properly, we will not see those comments on our end, which means you will still get those errors and warnings until we see those comments. So if you're not sure how to do that, again, always reach out to your program specialist and data and evaluation specialist to help you figure out that process in OLDC if you're attaching comments. That's pretty much it for module 2 and 4, and we focused heavily on module 2 and 4 because those are the forms that actually have an XML portion to it that needs to be uploaded into OLDC. Module 3 also has SmartForms. The difference is you're just not creating an XML from your module 3. You're simply uploading the Excel SmartForm itself for module 3. And again, we try to make this form as user-friendly as possible. And we did that after getting feedback from users out in the field. So throughout module 3, there's really just one tab that you have to complete in full, which has a lot of narrative items. And so for each narrative item, you can click on the edit button and they'll bring up a pop-up box where you can type in those narrative portions. For the screenshot you see on screen here, this is for selecting your CNPIs. Obviously in module 4, we have FNPIs for family national performance indicators. Because module 3 is focused on community, you're going to have community national performance indicators. So in the pop-up box, you just select the indicators that you plan on reporting on. And what that does is it tailors the rest of the tabs to what you selected. So there are tabs for each of the CNPIs. And so based off of what you select here, you're only going to see the tabs for the CNPIs that are relevant to the work you're doing in module 3. So there isn't really much else to say about module 3 other than that there's a lot of functionality built in to hopefully make it easier to navigate the form. And you want to make sure that you are attaching module 3, which I know OCS will go into detail during the OLDC webinar itself. But that's pretty much it for using the form itself. And I'm going to pass it back over to Kayla to walk us through resources.
All right, thank you so much. So that ends our SmartForms refresher. And we will now share resources that should help you through the reporting period. We can move to the next slide. So we have our regional contacts. Every branch in our division supports each region with a federal team that includes a program specialist, financial analyst, and a policy data and evaluation specialist. So here, if you locate your region, you can find the contacts assigned in your region. And as a reminder, always copy all of your assigned contacts during communication for the prompt responses. If for emailing for general technical assistance, please always remember to CC CSBG states at acf.hhs.gov. And if you need any assistance with OLDC, the online data collection system, please remember to copy CSBG data at acf.hhs.gov. And I believe the links for this on our website were just dropped in the chat with all of our contact information. We can move to the next slide. Yes, our contacts. We can click the next slide too as well. And here's the contact information for our colleagues at NASCAS. Thank you so much for joining us on the webinar today. We can drop that in the chat as well. And for our annual report resources, OCS and our national partners at NASCAS have several resources available on demand. Linked below and on the slide are the CSBG webinars page that covers the previous webinars for the fiscal year 2023 reporting period. NASCAS has also developed a number of resources to include an annual report lexicon, manual for module 3, and additional resources. We can move to the next slide. We'll be continuing our webinar series, and our next webinar that you've heard a lot about throughout the process of this webinar is the OLDC refresher webinar on December 14th from 3 p.m. to 4:30 p.m. EST. To receive info on how to submit your annual report via OLDC via Grant Solutions, that's the subject of the webinar. Registration is available at CSBG at the CSBG events calendar page, and that is linked in the chat. Thank you so much, everyone. We will now open it up to questions, and I'll ask all presenters to come back on camera. And please remember to use the Q&A pod. That's where we're going to be pulling the questions from. I already saw a question about when the PowerPoint will be made available and how are we going to get this information. And that will be posted and sent out to everyone. The webinar recording, slides, and transcript will be made available.
And Kayla, before we go into the rest of the questions, I did want to note, I forgot to mention this earlier. At the end of this webinar, we do ask that all of our participants stay on the line. We have a brief 4-question poll. Our goal is to make sure that these webinars are a good use of your time when we're answering your questions. So after we conclude the Q&A, and we give you a bit of thanks, we do ask that you just stick around for that. Kayla, back to you to read off these questions, and then we can give it to one of the panelists to answer.
Yes, thank you so much. Okay, so our first question, we have last year, there were new SmartForm functionality instructions for the eligible entities. Are there any changes? Are the forms the same as the last year? Are you expecting any functionality issues that we need to communicate to our eligible entities?
I can jump in here. That new SmartForm functionality that we had last year was that unblocking macros update that I mentioned at the beginning of this webinar. So all of that remains the same. It is no longer a new functionality. It just is part of how Excel operates. So yes, your eligible entities will still need to be made aware of how to unblock macros, which are those first few steps that I walked us through with clicking properties, selecting the checkbox to unblock macros, and then selecting OK.
Thank you. And then in that same vein, the next question is about the macros. What if we see the security risk message, but don't see an unblock option?
I have not run into that situation. So for that state, we might need to set up a call and do some screen sharing to make sure that we are seeing everything correctly. And then we can always run it past our SmartForm developer as well to see what options there are. But I have not run into that issue, and this probably needs more one-on-one technical assistance.
Okay. And then our next question is, how are the comments submitted?
So they're going to be attached to your state form in OLDC. And I know previous webinars on OLDC have walked us a little bit through that process. I do have probably a really old resource here. I don't even know where it originated from, but I can put it in the chat here. It was created a few years ago, but it gives you some step-by-step instructions on how to attach your comments in OLDC. But again, if you need assistance with that, I would reach out to your OCS contacts there to help you navigate OLDC.
Okay, thank you for that. I'm not seeing any other questions in the question and answer pod. Some of them are related to, okay, when this information will be available, but we've given that information. Are there any other questions that people have that they want to enter into the Q&A pod before we move on to the poll?
And I've been covering the ones that are in the chat and the Q&A pod. If we could go to the next slide, so we can get the poll started. So thank you all. Again, please don't drop off. We could use your feedback on this poll. Thank you all for joining us today. A few key reminders: making sure that you check your email for the SmartForm delivery. If you haven't seen anything and you know that you submitted your previous year's data on time, please reach out to us so that we can troubleshoot that as soon as possible. If you have received your SmartForms, opening it, making sure that you see the export buttons, everything looks great. That helps us to make sure that you don't go through this entire process and then have to re-enter the data and share on today's call. If you have any unique situations that would require some additional targeted technical assistance, reach out to us. If we can't answer it, we'll pull in our training and technical assistance partners at NASCAF to try to get you all an answer. And Nikki, with that, I think I'm ready to turn it over to you.